Hello. This is Tracy's world. Uh, excuse me a second. Today my lesson will be on 1 Samuel 17, and it's called Giants and Faith. Okay. To get in, I'm going to get the BibleDaily.com and have it read it to us.
1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." And the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage, and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Now what have I done? Said David. Even speak? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And the man answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported Saul. And Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul replied, You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David said to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sharaim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know. The king said, Find out whose son this young man is. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Whose son are you, young man? Saul asked him. David said, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem.
Okay, faithful viewers and hopefully future subscribers. That was 1 Samuel 17. Please excuse the act. Now verses 8. Now, first we focus on verses 8 through 11. 8 through 11 is the ones where David basically shows up David shows up, basically. Or, let me get where I said. Or Goliath shows up and defies Israel, which was his first big mistake. It was not Israel who he was defying, as it was God. And as history books have proven, that is never the brightest idea. God's chosen people were facing a giant named Goliath. Goliath was 9 feet tall. To give you an idea, this is what 9 feet tall is. Now, imagine a giant that size. And you probably, if you saw one, you'd probably be shaking in your boots too. Now the nation of Israel was focusing less on God and more on the size of the giant. They need to have faith in God. These people are seeing the size of the giant, not the God they serve. The Philistines won the land from Israel that God promised them. To give you a little geographic here. The land where Israel is, where it was in the middle of all these other countries. So, if a nation who basically, strategically, it was the perfect place for any. It was strategically, the land was perfect. I'll show you a map. This is what it looked like. Now, Israel was between all these other nations. It was between the nations. All these other nations. So, all the other countries around them wanted this land. But this way, is close to having a bunch of delicious desserts on a plate. And you have a lot of people, and there's one piece of dessert and last piece of dessert, and everybody wants it. Well, the last piece of dessert in this contest was Israel. Everybody wanted Israel because of like I said, the land. The next point I'm going to make is your status in life means nothing to God. If you heard the Bible stories with this, then you would think David was a little boy, 7 or 8, but no. At this time, you had to understand, David was 16 and 17 years old. He was old enough. He was a teenager, basically. He was not fully a grown-up yet, but he certainly wasn't a little boy like the pictures make him out to be. And like David put it to Saul, David had faith. Had faith to defeat the giant. When he heard that Goliath was to find Israel, thus God's chosen people, of course he was upset. Who wouldn't be? And recognized that Goliath was basically making fun of God. So that's why he told his brothers, and he was upset. Now I have to understand a little bit of the backstory here. King Saul, his armor, when David showed up, when Saul heard that David was willing to fight Goliath, he thought David needed what the common warrior needed. The problem is Saul trying to put his own armor on David was a bit of a problem because according to the Bible, he was a head and foot taller than the rest of his peers. So so you have this really tall man and this 17 years old. This really tall dude's armor's not going to fit on this David. But David didn't know how to use those weapons. Prepped him before with the sling and the staff. And the reason he got those 5 stones was not in case he missed. It was because Goliath had 5. There were 5 brothers, and 1 stone. And each stone was used for Goliath's skin. Now, you heard the passage. Basically, David tells Saul that he sees Goliath as no different as the lion or the bear that tried to eat the sheep. In God's eyes, the children of Israel were the metaphorical sheep, and he was their shepherd. You'll find, if you have access to a Bible, you'll find there's a lot of shepherd references in the Bible. Back to the point. Now, David had faith. He did not lean on his own abilities, because if he leaned on his own abilities, he'd be running and hiding and in the tent and crying for his mama. Like the rest of the Israelites, he had faith in God. Weirdly enough, Sometime back, the historians found Goliath's head with a rock in it, which proves that David the rock which was implanted in Goliath's head. Now, it would only cause Goliath to be unconscious, so that's the reason he cut the Goliath's head off. And now it sounds brutal, but when you're fighting an enemy, you just don't incapacitate them, you kill them. You don't want the enemy coming back to terrorize it again. Faith in God often leads to victory. It's those who have faith in God that do great stuff. It's their faith, not them. Because if we were to lean on our own abilities, that'd be our own abilities is a teeny tiny pebble. What faith in God is a big giant boulder. Basically.
Easy. Nothing. It's not a faith that does the things. It's our God who believe and does it. Because the world needs all you need is faith. Faith in what?
Faith in God. Faith in God is what causes it.
Not in your faith, it's your God. Think about it. Think about it.
Yes.
Your faith is nothing.
Yeah.
Your God is everything.
Yeah. Faith in what God can do.
Okay, now. I got that.
My dad just gave some interesting commentary. Thank you. Want to say hi to the possible viewers?
No. Get moving.
I hope y'all guys enjoyed this sermon. I hope this sermon, God worked through this sermon to help you out some. Until next Monday, this is Casey's World signing off.